So I want to introduce you to someone. This is Grace. And Grace really doesn't have a particular gender. But I think of Grace more as a feminine energy, so I call her. I call Grace her. And Grace is my constant friend and companion. Of course, this is a physical representation of Grace. I don't carry her around with me all the time, lest people get the wrong idea. But Grace is a friend, companion, always there, always abiding, presence. And Grace is also there in an abiding presence for you, always. And Grace really only has one message. And it's a very short message. Her message is, wake up. Sometimes Grace whispers it very softly. Sometimes she says it in a very loud voice. Wake up! Sometimes I listen, sometimes I don't. But she's always saying, wake up. Wake up from the dream. What's the dream? The dream is that we're separate. We're dreaming a dream that we're separate from God. Thus, we're separate from each other. You know, the story in Genesis, the creation story in Genesis, is a great, beautiful, metaphorical description for us to look at. God, Source, created Adam and Eve to live in the Garden of Eden, where everything was provided, everything was taken care of for them. They just had a life of ease. They walked every day in communion with God, side by side, knowing their oneness, knowing their unity in God. And I think that what that says to us is that we are created in the image likeness of God, of the divine. And that at our essence, that we are created, pre-programmed, wired for love and joy and wholeness, abundance, all of those things. But the story says that then we ate from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We began to believe that there's duality, good and evil, me and God, me and you. And so we created this image of ourselves. And through that image, we began to feel the shame and the fear that comes from that. We even began to fear God, so the story goes. We hid from God, because we're living in this dream of separation. And so Grace is always trying to wake us up to our unity, to our oneness. And that grace is an abiding presence because we are created as the image likeness of the divine, as an expression, that divine life and expression we have within us. No matter how far away we get in our minds, there is that within us, that presence that is always calling us home, always calling us to the remembrance that we are designed to live in the kingdom live in the garden. And we have a choice, right? We're given the gift of free will. So we can listen or not. We can listen to that voice calling us, or we can choose to ignore it. We can choose to continue to live in this idea, the dream of separation, where we suffer, where we're in fear, where we're in pain. That sense of separation where we are the ones who then act from that pain and that suffering. And while we witness other people in the world doing heinous acts of violence, we get to look at the violence that we're doing to ourselves and to each other. Maybe not in that extreme. But it comes from that sense of separation, living in the dream. But grace is always saying, wake up! That's not who you are. Wake up from the dream. And as I said earlier, sometimes grace speaks in a very soft whisper. Wake up! Wake up. And I experience that sometimes when I'm out in nature. When I feel peaceful, when I can just relax and breathe and be connected to the trees. Or if I'm looking up and seeing the stars or the sun or the moon or listening to the birds sing, grace is saying, wake up. Recognize your unity, your oneness with the stars and the trees, with the birds' song, with the mountains, with your surroundings. It's so much easier in places like that to hear grace say, wake up. And sometimes she speaks a little bit louder when I witness things out in the world. When I see things happening in the world that would cause me to feel fear. And I will be honest that sometimes I go directly there, to fear. But grace is always there saying, wake up, wake up. Come back to the garden. Come back to that place of knowing your unity, your oneness with the divine. Come back to knowing your true self, your divine self. That doesn't mean I ignore what's going on in the world, but when I can come back to that place, when grace says, wake up, and I listen, I can then know my unity, my oneness with God, with all creation, with all of you, and with everyone out there. Wake up, grace says. And then there are times when she has to scream it, wake up! Because there are some times when things happen in our lives, things happen in my life, directly in my life. Could lose a job even. Could somebody who I love could make their transition. A relationship could change form. There are all sorts of things that can happen in our lives where it's devastating at times for us. We think we'll never be able then to see the light of day again because we go into that place sometimes of pain and grief and mourning and what am I going to do? How am I going to ever survive this? Have any of us ever experienced that? I think maybe we all have at some level. And those are the times when it's most difficult to hear the voice of grace saying, wake up. That's not who you are. Because that fear, the pain, the suffering can deafen us sometimes to the voice of grace that is always there, calling us into a place of remembrance of who we really are. And I know for me there have been times when It's almost, it can take a long time. Let me just say that. Sometimes it can take a while to hear that voice. But I'm almost assured that for most of us, many of us who've experienced those challenging times in our lives, those painful times in our lives, that at some point we have been able to get through it. And if you're still there, trust that there is some point at which you can get through it, on the other side of it. And even when we get through the other side of those painful experiences, we can look back and we can feel the gratefulness. We can be grateful for grace, always calling us back to remembrance. And we can be grateful for the awareness of our unity in God and with each other. We can be grateful, full of the awareness of the greatness of God expressing in us and through us and as us. And then we can even find some place of gratitude for that thing that we thought was so awful in our lives. I've heard people express gratitude for coming through illnesses that changed their lives, that awakened them through the process of illness and everything they go through. Grace is always there saying, wake up. And on the other side of it, there's hope and there's gratitude. And so what I want to say today is that grace, sometimes this idea of grace can be confusing, but this is the way I like to think of grace. That it's the presence of the divine, the voice that is always calling us to wake up, to remember our truth, through any situation in our lives. Grace is a constant friend and companion, always abiding within us. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the church at Thessalonica said, "In everything give thanks." He did not say for everything give thanks. He said, in everything. And that, as I said, can be sometimes challenging, right? It's easy to be thankful when we're in the peaceful place of the nature and connection. It's not quite as easy when something is happening in the world. It's certainly not easy when we're going through some experience in our lives that is challenging for us. But I think what he was saying is, it's an attitude of gratitude that connects us with the divine life expressing in us. And we can touch that. Grace can remind us of that life that is moving in us, moving as us, through any experience that we are facing in the moment. And we can look back and find such gratitude for what might have happened sometimes. Paul also said in his letter to the church at Ephesus, "For by grace you are saved through faith, not of yourself, but this is a gift from God. By grace you are saved through faith, not of yourselves. It is a gift from God." What does that mean for us? When we think of grace as that voice within us that is always calling us home, wake up! Wake up from the dream. When we listen to that voice that says, wake up from the dream, if we listen, take it in, we're saved from our own sense of separation, from our own fear, from our own anxiety, from our own isolation and suffering. We're saved in the moment. We're saved from our own belief and our own being lost in the dream. But by grace we are saved through faith. Faith is the power that we have to see what is unseen, to have the belief and the conviction in the unseen power and presence of the activity of grace in our lives. So we exercise our power of faith to know that grace is always active, always calling us to wake up. It's not something that is outside of us. And it is a gift of God. Because you and I are created in the image, likeness of God. We are endowed with all of these faculties. And we are endowed with the presence of this light, this voice, this energy that we call grace, always calling us home. And so I invite us to listen to grace, the voice of grace, always saying, wake up, wake up, wake up from the dream. And as we listen, we can connect with the life of God that is our source, the creative, divine life energy of which we are an expression, filling us up in our hearts and in our minds. And then from that sense of gratefulness, we find gratitude and appreciation, thanksgiving in everything. In everything.